Well, good evening. Well, good evening. We seem to be operating on quite a considerable delay, and I'm not sure why. But let's hope that it comes through at your end. Good evening, and from the east coast of Australia, and good morning in Helsinki. I'm sorry I can't be there this year. And good afternoon or wherever else is applicable. So this is my annual public lecture that really precedes the... We seem to be operating on quite a considerable delay, and I'm not sure why. That precedes the... Let's hope that it comes through at your end. Good evening, and sorry, I'm getting funny signals back. This precedes a series of lectures I give in the postgraduate course in international relations and politics at Helsinki as part of my appointment there. And this one's really a general introduction, and then later on we get, in the next few weeks, we become more academic and more technical. So tonight I really want to talk about what's happened in the last year since I gave the last talk around this time last year. And the things that are obvious are that the pandemic has worsened, in my view. That the pandemic was part of what I've been calling the polycrisis, and that's worsened. That the pandemic really exposed the fictions of mainstream economics, particularly macroeconomics, and in exposing those fictions, we temporarily shifted to a period of fiscal dominance, and central banks actually articulated quite a different attitude towards their management of monetary policy, particularly in the sense that they abandoned this knee-jerk forward-looking approach that pushed up interest rates whenever they got a scent of price pressure, and with the consequence that they historically have caused problems to low-income workers and arguably increased unemployment rates, and maintained them at elevated levels. And they shifted that view to saying no, they'd tolerate higher inflation and they were going to prioritise maintaining low unemployment. So for a while there was some hope there, and I'll come back to how that's all evaporated. Also in the last year we've seen some very strange, let's call them political coalitions. And what I mean by this is that we've now got so-called progressive commentators aligning themselves with views expressed by rather extreme right commentators and forces, and participating in narratives that advance, in my view, the interests of capital and the elites at the expense of the rest of the population. And I'll talk about that a little bit later when I come to making an assessment of where we are with the pandemic. So this is a general discussion, and it's really to set me up for my classes in the next couple of weeks. So the first thing I want to talk about tonight is what I'm calling the sort of return to the inflation mania. And for a while, maybe a decade, we really had, or even longer, we had abandoned the obsessive focus on inflation as the primary evil. And largely that was because inflation had been really expunged from the system in the early 90s recession. The 91 recession around the world basically ended the long period of elevated inflation that it was initiated in 1973 by the OPEC oil price hikes. And the 91 recession essentially, and those oil price hikes drove a distributional struggle between labour and capital, who were keen to push the real income losses onto the other, and each had price setting power. Unions were much stronger then, and that really created what I would call a propagating mechanism to take the initial oil price shock and then propagate it into ongoing price rises as this distributional struggle unfolded. And that really ended. It was tapering through the 80s as trade unions became weaker, and in part because of quite restrictive industrial relations legislation that governments brought in to restrict their right to strike, and secondary boycotts and all of the other things that trade unions had used to defend their interests of their members. And also the recession in 91 was so large, it was the largest recession since the Great Depression in the 1930s, that it made it very hard for businesses to keep pushing up prices to defend margins. So we got rid of inflation at that point. Now, there was all sorts of contradictory narratives about what caused that, what led to that inflation going. And of course, the mainstream said it was because it was the shift to central bank dominance and inflation targeting and prudent, in inverted commas, fiscal management, the sort of shift to an obsession with fiscal surpluses or low deficits. Now, the reality was it was the demolition of the trade union movement and the massive bankruptcies that occurred in the recession that did it. And when you do statistical work, and I've done this myself, analysing the differential conducts between central banks in the last 20 or 30 years, the inflation targeting central banks really have no better inflation outcomes than the non-inflation targeting central banks. So the big question that emerged during the pandemic was, how are we going to deal with the fact that supply side of the economy was massively disrupted? Disrupted because shipping became disrupted, factories couldn't operate at normal levels, tens of thousands of workers were unable to work because they were ill and dying, and governments took, in my view, most governments took, in my view, a sensible attitude, and I qualify that in a moment, to maintain income security for a substantial portion of their workforce. Now, why the qualification is that they didn't cover everybody in Australia, for example, casual workers were largely not protected, which was a travesty, and the protection of other workers wasn't adequate enough. But the reality was that while we were engaging in these highly restrictive government policies to reduce the prospect of rapid widespread infections before sufficient vaccination rates were achieved, the supply side certainly contracted significantly. Now, in some countries like Australia, that was exacerbated by bushfires and floods, bushfires destroying plantation timber and floods destroying food crops and the sort, and as a consequence that exacerbated the supply constraints. Now, the other angle was related to what I've just said, is that the restrictions really closed the service sector down: hospitality, tourism, travel, and the income support maintained incomes. And people not able to spend those incomes on going to the theatre or sporting events or going out to dine, then they transferred that spending to the goods sector. And as a consequence, and the goods sector was subject to tight supply constraints, and it couldn't meet the increased demand with output delivery, and as a consequence, we started to see price pressures. Now, it was not unsurprising. It was quite clear that was going to happen, and my view at the time, and still is or was, that those price pressures were transitory. Now, transitory doesn't mean necessarily short term. What it means is that the extraordinary combination of factors that were creating those pressures would abate very quickly once the supply constraints were eased, and to a certain extent we're starting to see that now, that the supply side is recovering somewhat. Ships are going to where they want to go, and factories have reopened largely, excluding some of the current Chinese situation, and price rises driven by those constraints are starting to disappear. Now, the problem was that just after I delivered my last annual talk in Helsinki, Russia decided to invade the Ukraine. Now, I'm not going to present a position on that. The mainstream Western narrative is, oh, isn't that shocking? Mr. Putin's a despot. And of course, an alternative view is that the Western elite advanced nations created conditions in the Ukraine that generated threats that triggered it. But I'm not an analyst, a military analyst, and so we'll leave that alone. But the point is that a lot of timber and a lot of food crops, and particularly grains, come out of that region, and Western Europe build up a false sense of security relying on Russian energy resources. And so on top of the pandemic constraints, we had additional price pressures. Now, are they structural or transitory? I think they're transitory. But transitory doesn't mean short term, remember. It may endure. And those sort of price pressures will endure until, say, the Western Europe reorients its energy demand away from Russia, which it's doing, and alternative sources of grain, etc., are found. Now, on top of that, then OPEC decided to take advantage of the situation and drive up oil and petrol prices around the world. And so we saw a huge escalation in energy prices, which then fed into the supply chain in terms of transport cost rises, and that fed into the supermarkets delivering goods and services. So that's created further price pressures. Now again, they're all transitory influences, and what I really mean by that is that propagation mechanism that I mentioned before that drove the 1970s inflation through into the 1980s, they're gone. Labor is unable to defend its real wage at the moment, and real wages all around the world are declining more or less quite rapidly, and so there's no real wage resistance coming from the unions. There is margin gouging from capital in certain sectors, but there's nothing to really push those initial shocks into a structural inflation. And certainly, when I talk about transitory inflationary episode, I'm also not buying into the mainstream narrative that this was an inevitable concept, in an inevitable outcome of the fiscal support that was given to societies during the pandemic, the early stages of the pandemic. That's not sustainable, that argument. This is all of a supply side event. Now, if you then say, well, as a lot of mainstream economists are saying, well, we've got to then impose fiscal austerity, well, you're not going to increase supply by reducing demand very much and hacking into spending. All you'll do is make the price pressures, the problems that the price pressures are causing for low-income families, all you're doing is going to make them worse, because you'll make those families unemployed. And so the sensible approach at the moment to the inflation is to be patient, and already around the world we're seeing the price pressures abating, and because those supply factors are resolving to some extent, and I emphasise only to some extent, and so it's the better government response at the moment would be to provide fiscal support to low-income families, and so that they don't endure the cost of living squeeze that really stops them being able to feed their children and keep their houses warm. And this is the approach, for example, that the Japanese government has taken, and I'll talk about Japan a bit more. But the problem is, of course, that the shift in early in the pandemic towards fiscal dominance has been abandoned. The mainstream neoliberal narrative, the sound finance narrative that demonises fiscal deficits and prioritise a policy assignment to monetary policy to maintain macroeconomic stability, that's now reasserted itself. And so over the last 9 or 10 months, we've seen a dramatic rise in interest rates around the world, except for Japan, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And it's very interesting, because then if you ask yourself, well, what were the interest rates rises going to do? Now, the mainstream narrative was that it was going to kill growth and force a squeeze on disposable incomes, and particularly those with debt, and that squeeze would reduce spending and take pressure off the price level. Now the problem is that even if the inflation was a demand side event, excessive demand, it's questionable whether interest rate rises work anyway. Now why is that? Well, there's two main reasons. One is that there are distributional consequences of interest rate rises that central banks don't understand, and these are that the debtors lose out real income and creditors gain real income. And we don't know what the consequences of that, the net effect of that really is. And all we can see around the world is that the demand at the moment for luxury cars is booming, and the growth isn't falling into recession yet. And it doesn't appear that the interest rate rises are following the mainstream narrative. But what they are doing is damaging low-income mortgage holders to the point that many of those mortgage holders are going to lose their homes. In Australia, for example, a lot of mortgage holders, when interest rates were relatively low, took out fixed rate contracts lock those low rates in. Now, most of those contracts are terminating in the coming months, and then they'll be forced to renegotiate with the banks at the much higher rates. They'll lose their homes, many of them. And the other consequence of the interest rate rises are that they've delivered dramatic boost in profits to bank shareholders. And moreover, and I did some analysis of this recently, the quantitative easing programs that central banks have engaged in for many years build up a large supply of excess reserves in the banking system as a consequence of swapping bank reserve credits for buying government bonds. And then they took the central banks took the step of providing interest rate support for those excess reserves, because if they hadn't done that, then the overnight interest rate would drop to zero. So they were paying a support rate, a yield to the banks. So the banks didn't care that particularly they had excess reserves. And now with interest rates rising, those support rates are rising, and trillions of currency units, dollars, whatever, euros, are flowing to the banks. So what you're seeing is that over the last 9 months, there's been a massive redistribution of income event going on, deliberately contrived event, managed and perpetuated by central banks, damaging the well-being of low-income families and workers, and slavishly rewarding the shareholding class and the bank executives who leverage their incomes off bank profits. Now, the other interesting thing is that in the last year, as we've reasserted these phobias about government debt and government deficits, is that military spending has gone through the roof. Even Japan has abandoned, or is about to abandon, their post-war pacifist stance and are escalating military spending. Now, so you think about this, on the one hand, you've got all this pressure going on in our political debates. Oh, we've got to cut spending, public spending has to be reduced, we've got to move back towards surplus. but at the same time, we're creating massive outlays in military spending. You know, the Australian government is going to buy some howitzers or something ridiculous and planning to put them up on the north coast to defend ourselves against China. I mean, all this ridiculous stuff. The generals are having a picnic. And the military-industrial complex around the world is having a picnic, particularly centred in the US. And if you think about that, that presents a really huge problem for the progressive side of politics. Because on the one hand, they like to hold out that they are peaceniks, and the military-industrial complex needs to be substantially reduced. Yet, on the other hand, the spending that the governments have been outlaying on this new era of militarism is stopping the economies from failing. And so the question then is, well, if you want to run a line that you don't want that military spending, and I certainly run that line, then you have to work out, well, how are you going to fill that spending gap with spending on things that the progressive side would find desirable: public hospitals, public schools, infrastructure, renewable energy, and all that stuff. And whichever way you want to think about it, that requires a debate about larger government. Now, the corporations that benefit from the military-industrial complex, they don't ever blink when they get this, when the Treasury in whatever nation we're talking about announce huge outlays for missiles and, you know, the billions of dollars that are going to blow each other up on the border of Ukraine and Russia and the Western support is amazing. Nobody blinks and asserts this, huge deficits, bad spending, all the rest of it. But if you dare mention some community support for a poor neighbourhood to allow a kid to go to school with a full stomach, then gosh, the world's going to fall apart because the deficit will be too high. And that's a huge problem for the progressive side of politics. Now, the other part of this last 12 months has been the shift in the way we saw the state. So before the pandemic, of course, the neoliberal view was that the state was largely powerless against global capital and had to construct policy design to meet the requirements of global capital, or else the latter would destroy the currency. Now, the reality, the left and the progressive side of politics bought that argument in the 1970s, and that's why neoliberalism became dominant. Now, what really happened, and we outline this in detail, considerable detail, in Reclaiming the State, which we wrote in 2017. What really happened over the last 3 decades was that the neoliberal agenda just reconfigured the state to advance the interests of capital at the expense of the workers. And what the pandemic did very quickly was expel the idea that the state is powerless, because capitalism went on life support in 2020. And without that massive injections of the public sector spending, then it's probable that substantial portions of capital would have collapsed. Definitely financial capital, a lot of industrial capital. And recently I've been working in Japan, and as a professorial fellow at Kyoto University, and I'll be going back there again presently. But what you learn in Japan is that as the rest of the advanced countries have really gone back to this assertion that the state is powerless and has to pursue surpluses, and that the central bank must raise interest rates to fight inflation. What Japan's done is completely different. It hasn't increased interest rates. It's still maintaining what they call yield curve control, which is basically putting an upper limit on the 10-year Japanese government bond. Now, it's very interesting that the financial markets, who care only about themselves, nothing to do with national well-being, that have been believing their own braggadocio, believing that they are all powerful, have been entering into various financial contracts, speculative contracts, thinking that they can outwit the Bank of Japan and the government of Japan and profit. And what you're seeing is that the Bank of Japan isn't blinking. It's maintaining its low interest rate yield curve control stance. Its inflation, and if you think about Japan, it was subject to the same global forces as all of us in terms of these supply pressures, but its inflation rate's very low relatively, and it's fairly flat. And what the Japanese government did was provide income support to low-income families, was to provide support to energy companies not to push up energy prices significantly. The Japanese government provided other supports which kept price pressures contained and well-being protected, and have just basically sailed against the Pavlovian type behaviour of the rest of the advanced world. And they've been doing that for 30 years, Japan. And if you go and live in Japan, you'll see that the standard of living is very high. Good public transport, very strong emphasis on public schooling, good public hospitals. And that's a model for the way the state should conduct itself. Now, everyone says, oh yeah, Japan's an exception. Well, it is an exception, but it's an exception because they've made choices. The monetary institutions in Japan are virtually identical to the monetary institutions everywhere. The way the central bank and the commercial banks operate, the way the treasury operates, it's the same as everywhere. Different names to things, whatever. But what's different in Japan is that they've maintained a solidaristic culture, a culture built on empathy and looking out for society. And as a consequence, I was talking to one business person recently in Kyoto, and they said to me they hate creating unemployment. They hate to lay off workers. They'll do anything but lay off a worker. Now you juxtapose that with the way in which the rest of the advanced countries operate. The neoliberalism has created this almost evangelistic elevation of the individual, and that some individuals are expendable. We just leave them on the unemployment trash heap. And that the point is that that's a deliberate choice that's being made. It's got nothing to do with Japan being an exception. They are an exception, but it's an exception that everybody could enjoy if we still believed in solidaristic society. Now, I want to talk a bit about the pandemic, and I'm aware I don't want to go for much longer. We're now allegedly in a post-COVID era, and we're living with COVID, which I find curious given that tens of thousands of people are still dying with COVID. And what COVID has done is expose structural inequalities, and it's impacted worse on low-income families because they were exposed in their workplaces, they weren't supported properly and by fiscal policy, and they live in housing estates and apartment blocks that are not conducive to disease control, particularly in infectious disease. And there's a very good article in the last week in Nature, and it brings together all of the current research that is being done in the scientific community. And what it tells us is that society has a real problem on its hands, because what we have is a disease that's not the flu. It's a much more dangerous disease than that. And even mild infections in the initial phase are now being found to cause much longer term health problems for various major organs in our bodies. And we have a sort of screech squad out there, a very vocal set of voices saying that it's all a international conspiracy, that it was a conspiracy of the pharmaceutical companies, that it was a conspiracy by governments to take advantage and control us and introduce authoritarian governments. Now, I just reject all of that outright. Yes, the pharmaceutical companies profited, but that was the fault of government. They could have easily asserted a relinquishment of patent rights for that particular products or the particular products. And I think that the narrative that the restrictions were bad and that we've got to go back to freedom. Well, when you've got long COVID and you've now got millions of people who are disabled, some permanently, as a consequence of this disease, you can't have freedom. And so I urge people to have a look at the Nature article, because it really, towards the end of it, it discusses what our policy choices are. And given that this disease is going to stay with us probably forever, and it has the impact as having these long-term impacts upon our labour force and our lives. And so, from my perspective, governments have now fallen back into satisfying the elites of capital who opposed the restrictions and were quite happy to see people die because it meant that they could make profits still. The restrictions curtailed the ability of some firms to make profits. And I think what we've got to what governments should be doing at the moment is educating the populations on infection control, and that includes mask wearing and other strategic actions that can be taken, improved ventilation in our offices and schools and closed public spaces, and all the rest of things that have just now fallen by the wayside as we've started to believe this narrative of the post-pandemic era. Well, the pandemic hasn't gone away, and it's going to require massive policy responses if we're going to minimise the long-term effects, which are now becoming more obvious. I wanted to talk briefly about Europe. What we're now seeing is a fundamental contradiction between reality and the rhetoric. And the rhetoric is embodied in the treaties that establish the common currency, for example, and the fiscal rules, the Stability and Growth Pact and the Fiscal Compact and all the rest of the stuff, mainstream sound finance stuff that supported the treaty process, and the excessive deficit mechanisms that have punished some countries irreparably in Greece's case, in my view. But what we're seeing, and we've been seeing this since the global financial crisis, is that the only way the Eurozone is surviving is because the European Central Bank is effectively funding fiscal deficits through its various bond buying programs. Now the question, and during the pandemic, of course, we had the relaxation of the Stability and Growth rules, the excessive deficit procedure, which allowed the government deficits to go well beyond the 3% threshold in the Stability and Growth Pact, and provide some support to their income support to get the countries through the early days of the pandemic. Now the question is, if Brussels starts to reassert the excessive deficit procedure and impose austerity again, and if the ECB was to stop buying bonds in substantial quantities, then what do you think would happen? Well, I know what would happen. Some of the countries, particularly Italy and Greece and Portugal, would go broke. Spain would go broke. And the Eurozone would collapse. And so you've really got this contradiction that the European policymakers are not going to be able to go back and assert the treaty rules very easily. And so the question then is, in terms of the political space, is how's that going to play out? And that's given that one of my interests is European economy, monetary systems, then that's very interesting thing to study over the next years coming up. And the last thing I want to talk about is climate. This will be about 5 minutes and then I'm prepared to take questions. So all around the world at the moment we've got major climate events, bushfires, flooding, droughts, excessive rain, ice sheets melting, ridiculously cold weather when it shouldn't be cold, and ridiculously hot weather when it shouldn't be hot. And the climate scientists who are credible are saying that there's now an absolute urgency it's in an existential sense, there's an urgency. Now the question then is, well, what are we going to do about it? Well, there's a lot of narrative about green transitions or green new deals, and that makes progressive people feel warm and cosy that we're going to have this green new deal. But already, if you examine what's happening, the agenda is being captured by the neoliberal elites, the financial elites. Green bonds and all of the sort of funding nonsense that's what's required is a massive shift towards public sector activity. There's no doubt about it. The private market is not going to deliver what we want quick enough, and so progressives and conservatives are still hanging on to mainstream fictions about the need for governments to fund themselves. And so there's all this warm and cosy stuff about green bonds being discussed and products that will just effectively provide profits to the financial markets and window dress the changes that are required. And also the progressive side of the debate can't get their head away from market-based solutions like carbon taxes and emission trading schemes. Now, the experience so far with trading schemes are, particularly the carbon offset schemes, are that they are an absolute disaster. They're a sham. They allow the major polluters to keep polluting so that they go and plant a few trees somewhere else, particularly in poor communities. And there's a lot of evidence in poor communities that major multinational concerns are coming in and virtually bribing local authorities to build offset infrastructure, which tramples traditional subsistence agriculture and cultural integrity. It's just a nonsense, and the market solutions also are corrupted by the lobbying groups who will exempt this and that. So in Australia, the carbon trading system was going to exempt some of the largest polluters because it was politically too difficult to include them into the restrictions. And so increasingly I've become of the view that the degrowth agenda is the only way that progressives can maintain integrity in this debate. Now, I'm not going to go into that in a lot of detail here, but effectively it requires a fundamental transformation of production, consumption, housing, transport. In other words, fundamental change in economic activity, the organisation of it, the composition of outputs, what we consume and what we aren't able to consume any longer, the taking on the motor vehicle companies, increased provision of well-ventilated public transport, and fundamental shifts like that. Now, the question that I pose is that possible? And the conclusion I'm coming to is that capitalism has reached its end date. It's not sustainable if we are to be sustainable as societies. And that initial quote that you saw from me was that a system that prioritises the pursuit of private profit over everything else can't possibly deliver the changes that are required for us to address the climate challenge, much less the health challenge, much less the labour market challenge, which I haven't mentioned much tonight, much less all of the other challenges of the polycrisis. Now, I haven't got a crystal ball, but it's looking pretty bleak. So I'll leave it there, thank you, and I'll check out the questions, and I'm prepared. It's now 1 hour gone. I'm prepared to answer questions for some time. So what I'm going to do is, it's a bit awkward, these live streams, so I don't have an assistant with me or anything. So what I'm going to do is look through the chat, and I'll answer questions in the order that I can see them, if I can answer them. So someone wants a discussion about a common currency between Argentina and Brazil. Oscar's from Argentina, it seems. Well, look, common currency arrangements are fraught with difficulties if there's not a cultural integrity between the two geographic spaces, in this case countries, unless there's a acceptance across the two countries that a central fiscal authority can make permanent transfers to any region in that common space without resentment, that there are shared ideals, national ideals, in relation to what the central fiscal authority can do, and that the individual geographic components, in this case Brazil and Argentina, would have to cede their own fiscal responsibility to a federal or a combined fiscal institution like a treasury, and cede their central banks to a common central bank, and that those macroeconomic policy institutions would have to be democratically accountable to a national government that spanned the two countries. That's my view. Unless you're in a position to do that, and I doubt very much whether those two countries are in that position, then a common currency will be as bad for those two countries as it is for the now 20 countries in the Eurozone. I'm just looking again. So someone wants to know, is an MMT in some way contradictory to degrowth? If there's more money through government investment, through more printed money, isn't there more money to consume? Okay, that's a really good question, and I know there's elements in the degrowth debate that advance that view, that government spending has to be cut significantly for us to have degrowth. Well, what degrowth is about, and most people confuse it or express it in terms of we've got to have lower GDP, gross domestic product. Now, gross domestic product's just a measure of the total production in the economy. Now, typically it is fairly closely correlated with energy use in the economy. particularly carbon intensive usage. But it doesn't have to be, and this is this so-called decoupling concept, that we should be achieving policy design that decouples energy use from economic activity. And so just saying, okay, yeah, if governments are spending into the economy, say, to build more coal-fired power stations, well, of course that's contrary to degrowth. But if the government's investing in music schools and art colleges that are delivering skill development, employment, and with a very small carbon footprint, then that doesn't undermine the degrowth agenda, in my view, in the same way that investing in coal-fired power stations would. So I don't think there's an inherent contradiction. I think we need a shift in the composition of output and towards non-carbon using activities. And in a way, from a progressive point of view, this shift towards personal care services and an elevation of cultural activities and recreational activities can significantly reduce carbon utilisation while maintaining employment and providing opportunities for communities. But don't get me wrong, most of the advanced world has to consume much less in material sense and consume more non-carbon activities and consume less overall, definitely. Okay. All spending is new dollars as a result of political will in Congress because it is bank deposits and bank reserves. Okay, I don't know what the question is. This was man in a pit. I don't actually... Oh, so there's some more. Okay. That's a statement, not a question. Okay, are there any more questions? Because we can finish. If it's not, it's interestingly, at this time of the year when I'm in Helsinki, this is pre-pandemic, it's extremely cold, obviously. Whereas when I leave for Helsinki in Australia, it's normally very hot. Well, I'm in Australia at the moment, it's very hot. So there's a question, can you tell us more about Japan's case? Why don't they put the interest rate up? That's a great question. And well, because they've stated this publicly. The governor of the Bank of Japan has stated it publicly. But if you talk to Bank of Japan officials, they state it privately, that they believe the current inflation is transitory. They don't believe that there's any significant long-term structural inflation bias in the system, and they are not prepared to start pushing up the cost of living via interest rates on low-income families for a transitory event. They're prepared to be patient, provide fiscal support to low-income families, to provide certain inducements to energy companies not to pass on all of the imported price rises, and they're prepared to take that fiscal responsibility so that they don't lose the well-being in their society. And the reason for that is, as I articulated, that they've still got a very empathetic collective solidaristic culture. They believe in looking after each other, and whereas particularly the English-speaking West, we've adopted a view of individuals, sink or swim, dog eat dog. And it's your responsibility to look after yourself. And if you're lagging behind, do something about it. It's not the state's responsibility. Well, that's a different way of seeing society, and I know which one I prefer. Yes, there's a question about tomorrow. The next 5 lectures are not via YouTube, they're Zoom lectures, and they're to a class in a postgraduate program, so they won't be public events like this. Is Japan receiving new migrants? Well, no, they're not. They're reluctant to increase migration. Now, many people believe that's because they're xenophobic and hate migrants, and there's elements of that. But the other thing to understand is that Japan has a high population and most of the country is uninhabitable. It's got a huge mountain range down the centre of it. That means that most urban development has to be in the coastal areas, and they're obviously limited. And so it's difficult to imagine strong population growth emerging, being sustainable there. Now, there's a huge debate in Japan, and the Prime Minister just yesterday came out with a dramatic address to the Diet, to Parliament, where he said that in the long term Japan wasn't going to be functional because the population growth's now negative, and the population's going to shrink as the society ages, and that it'll be difficult to sustain current activities. Well, we had this discussion several times recently in Japan, and my view was that, and one of the things that you learn when you live there is that over 99% of businesses are small to medium, and the majority of those are owned by people above 70 years of age. So there's this dramatic urgency among the government to work out ways in which those businesses can be transferred rather than the person just getting old and closing the business. Now, my argument in that debate, when we were having these debates in Kyoto, was that in actual fact, letting those businesses just atrophy because the owners got too old may not be a bad thing, because it means that they can reduce their potential to grow as the climate urgencies become dominant. So there's lots of debate going on about population in Japan, that's true. So someone has asked, do you think Europeans eventually will realise moving forward with fiscal federation is the only solution to stop the Eurozone disintegrating? Look, I addressed this question in my 2015 book, Eurozone Dystopia. And my position then, and I think my position still, is that creating a true federal system is the only way it can survive. But under current circumstances, I don't believe that that's going to be possible. And I don't believe the frugal nations in the north and who are really just part of Germany Co, what I call Germany Co, I don't think they're ever going to backtrack and allow a true federal system to emerge where, there's a debate going on at the moment about the state of Eurobonds. So the European Commission during the pandemic, under 2 policy initiatives, were allowed to issue Eurobonds to allegedly fund the fiscal transfers. But they are not grants to the member states, they were debts. They've got to be paid back, and there's no further Eurobonds going to be issued after, I think, December last year. And the outstanding Eurobonds will eventually mature and disappear. So the question is that going to be the basis of a Eurobond market? Well, definitely not. The market's going to get very thin very soon, and I don't believe that Germany and the Frugal Four are going to agree to a full-scale federal treasury and accountable to the people being able to make permanent fiscal transfers to any nation or region. I just don't believe that's going to happen, and so I think it's either disintegration, slowly but surely, or the European Central Bank is going to have to keep buying government bonds. So someone else has also asked about, is the European Commission going to return back to the Stability and Growth Pact? Well, they probably can. The real thing keeping the Eurozone alive is the bond buying of the European Central Bank. They can keep the currency union intact through that and still return to their austerity mindset under the excessive deficit procedure. And that just means that the well-being will, across the zone, will worsen relative to what it might be now. And then what they'll have to deal with is the increasing social instability that, for example, you saw with the yellow vests in France. And that'll become more widespread, I think, if they do impose significant austerity again. I think it's a fascinating bind that the policymakers are in, both the monetary and fiscal policymakers. The Commission will be under significant pressure not to reintroduce the excessive deficit mechanism, but I think they will. And the central bank is under massive pressure not to continue buying bonds, but I think they'll resist that because they know that if they don't keep buying bonds, the spreads on member state yields against the bund will rise significantly, and we'll be back to May 2010 and June 2012, where some governments would basically run out of money given that they don't issue their own currencies. Someone wants to know, if capitalism has arrived at its end, what next? Well, as I said, I haven't got a crystal ball, but I think what's lying ahead is a period of substantial uncertainty and chaos, and I have significant fears that when those sort of chaotic challenges emerge, military solutions are invoked. I'm not qualified to know what's going to happen. I just know that we're in a state that those challenges, the contradictions of neoliberalism, have all conflated. They've all combined. We now no longer should talk about, the gig economy crisis or the inequality crisis or a health crisis or a climate crisis. or a public infrastructure crisis. These are all part of the same crisis, and they're the culmination of 3 decades or more of neoliberal policy that was unworkable from the beginning. You can't have a society where the top end of the income and wealth distribution just plunder and become increasingly wealthy with high incomes at the expense of the rest. And what we've been seeing is a hollowing out of the middle class, and in some countries that's accelerated more than in other countries, and in effect social stability was maintained even with inequality by the middle class and the mass consumption ambitions of the middle class. Now, as you start hollowing out the middle class and depriving them of the very essence of what middle class society post Second World War was, then you've got real problems. So I think we're on this very short-termism type mentality now, where capital and the financial capital are pocketing as much as they can as quickly as they can, and that's unsustainable. It's unsustainable both in social terms but also in climate terms. What happens is I don't know. So I'm sort of running out of questions, and if one doesn't pop up very soon, I'm going to say good night, and thank you all for taking your time, precious time, to attend this public lecture. I hope in 2024 I can do it in person, even though I'm trying to work out a way not to fly anymore. But thanks very much for your time, and I'll see my postgraduate students tomorrow via Zoom, and I'll wish you all well for the evening, and take care. See you later.